Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Okay, good morning. Hope you have enjoyed the break. Okay. Thanks for coming early in the morning, after the break. Okay, so last week we were talking about state capitalism. Okay, and then this is where we ended. So basically, for China's privatization, we saw this complete and incomplete, right, privatization. So if it's done properly, right, then which these authors called complete privatization, or a complete restructuring, then you could see that the performance were better, right? But these three authors, Dengan and He, they say that quite a large number, I think they almost say like 3/4 of these China's privatization was done in an incomplete way, right? So this is when incomplete restructuring is when the government decides to privatize, then the unproductive asset or the unproductive sector of the SOE, right? So that sits on top of, as a parent company of the listed company, right? So therefore, there could be a lot of business or some transactions between this parent company and the listed company, which is which was shown in this related party transactions. So these transactions could be priced, right, in a very obscure or very vague, right, way, which means that the price they might give, these transactions might give favor to one of the parties, right? So that's why the performance of these SOEs, when they are restructured in an incomplete format, then their performance was bad, right? So that's what we saw. And in general, this is what we saw, right? The performance of SOEs when they are privatized and listed, what happens is that their performance tends to be poor. Okay, so that's what people have found. And then why is that case? Well, there could be, people hired, right, from the government. You can say it's politically connected CEOs or managers. So that could be the case, right? But then we also saw the case where, okay, these three authors say, well, it may not be just that. It could be, also something else. The way SOEs restructure themselves. Okay, but in general, what we find is that the government control is not necessarily the best, right? So, but you can flip this argument and say that if you compare the SOEs, right, which is, the privatized SOEs, which are listed on the stock exchange. So once they are listed, or when they are listed, they have to go through proper listing requirements, right? So therefore, like accounting, disclosure, and all these things, right? It's basically they have to follow a certain rule when they are listed. So that means if you compare these companies, listed companies, with private companies, private means non-listed, right? It could be, like a firm, especially in China, there has been a lot of private firms, right? That has been running since like mid-1990s. And these companies often had financing from overseas, like, overseas families. And these were not listed companies, right? So if you compare these kind of, companies which are not private, which are not listed, but privately run, right? Of course, there could be some involvement by the government, especially local governments. But then you compare with these companies which are properly listed, right? Although the ownership of, or the state control might have problems. So the question is, how come these, state-controlled but listed companies are not doing well, right? So that's basically our next question about. That's the next. Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about. Oops, sorry. This week. So this is called China's economic growth puzzle. Okay. And we'll talk about sovereign wealth funds, which is a separate topic, probably next week. Okay, so this growth puzzle is basically coming from this paper. It's called Allen, Chen, and Chen. One of the Chens is Professor Meijun Chen, who is with us at ANU. So these three authors wrote this paper called Law, Finance, and Economic Growth in China. And this has been a very controversial paper, which means that it raised a question, okay? So the question is that, according to Law and Finance, right, LLSB, if a company or a firm is operating under good law and under good institutions or under good law, then that should improve the growth, right? So that's basically better law, better institutions promote growth. Okay. So what they asked is, let's look at China's growth, and then they found that the listed sector right? Well, the assumption, not assumption, the proposition of this LLSV is that the listed sector is properly governed, right? I mean, at least they have to go through these listing requirements. So that's why they should be governed by better law or institutions. So the growth of these listed sector should be faster than the rest. So that's basically would be the proposition according to LLSV, right? Because better law, better institutions. Okay, but what happened is that what they found is that that the growth, faster growth came from non-listed sectors. Okay, so that's why this is called a puzzle, right? So if you apply this theory of law and finance or law and economics, the listed sector should grow faster, right? But what they find is the non-listed sector grew faster, much faster. Okay. Okay. So that's why the question is, how did they grow faster, right? But here, since we're talking about this law and institutions, and we have not looked at China specifically, right? So then this is a table that looks at, this is the creditor rights, okay, for China. So this is comparing this LLSV sample, which is, English, French, German, Scandinavian origin. So these numbers come directly from this LLSV, okay? And then they compare the creditor rights for China, okay? So here, if you can see, right? So 1 means they have, right? So, and 0 means they don't. So no automatic stay on assets, right? So in China, there's no, basically, there's no automatic stay, right, on assets. So that's 0. Secured creditors are paid first. Well, it's 0. Okay. Restriction for going into reorganization, there is. Yes. Management does not stay in reorganization. There is. Okay. So overall, the score is 2. Okay. But LLSV average is 2.3. And if you look at, French origin average, it's 1.58, right? Scandinavian origin is 2. So this score of 2 for China is not, any lower than other countries. Okay, so English origin does have, the highest score, which is 3.11. So if you look at this, right, I mean, it's not, doesn't look like China, it's bad, right? Okay. And this is the shareholder rights. Okay, so again, comparing with a LLSV sample, if you just look at the average, let me see. Is there a, let me see. This should be the average. Oh, it's not the average, sorry. One, two, three. No, I think this is the average, yeah. But if you compare China against the rest, right? Again, I mean, it doesn't look bad, right? It doesn't, basically, it does have one share, one vote, right? But of course, there are, you know, by law, right, it's one share, one vote, but the government could control the company in, you know, different ways. But at least on paper, it is one share, one vote, okay? So, and then proxy by mail allowed and all these items here is not there, but you can see oppressed minority. There is, you know, a rule or law in place to protect minority shareholders, and then preemptive right to new issue. So this is to, you know, this is to protect the dilution of the shares for the existing shareholders. So that's in place. And percentage of shares capital to call an extraordinary shareholder meeting, yeah, you need like 0.1. It's a bit higher than others, but it's 10%. But it's not, you know, that different from like the LLSV sample, right? Of course, the French origin needs like 15%, right, to call of the minimum 15% of the share capital to call for extraordinary shareholder meeting. So this is how it looks like. Yeah. So anti-director rights. Let me see. Yeah, that's right. This overall score is the sum of the scores of rows 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7. Yeah, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. And then, yeah, so that's why, yeah, so anti-director rights is, this is like the summary, right? Okay, so, so as you look at here, this is shareholder rights, and then this is creditor rights. So if you compare against the LLSV sample, the creditor rights and shareholder rights are not that, you know, low. It's about, you know, it's comparable to the LLSV sample, okay? So that's why if, you know, the listed companies, right, follow this rule, then shareholders and creditors should be well protected, right? So according to law and finance, then the listed firms should grow faster, right? But the puzzle is that the non-listed sectors in China grew much faster. Okay. So, yeah, so as I said, at least a legal system on paper may not look that bad. It's quite comparable. And then the next thing is the law enforcement. Okay. So if you look at the law enforcement, there are not many items. This is, NA is non-applicable, but rule of law, right? Corruption, right? Rule of law, actually, yeah, it's, if you compare against all these averages of different origins, it is lower, right? It is in fact low, yeah. So, but I think this is the lowest, right? The corruption. Yeah, so this has been said for many years, right? The practice of corruption, okay? So nowadays, I think it's becoming, you know, in the recent years, China has been tightening this, right? Corruption, right? So if you did a survey now, maybe this number may not be that low. But this is, you know, surveyed in perhaps until early 2000 or around year 2000. So basically the data or the information is from the 90s, mid-90s to maybe early 2000. Yeah. But, you know, the things are changing. So if we do this research again, then this might not be that, you know, low. But the thing is, right, this paper is trying to find out, according to this law and finance, basically compare using this framework, China and the rest of the world. And they find that at least the creditor rights, shareholder rights are quite comparable. But the rule of law is probably not that bad, but I guess this corruption, right, is probably the lowest. Okay. And then this LLSV sample that we saw, these basically include, developed countries, right? So it is sometimes it's not fair to compare China, especially from during the 90s, right, with some of these developed countries. So next thing what they did was they compare against emerging countries. Okay, so this is probably a fair comparison. And then here they're looking at efficiency of the judicial system, rule of law, corruption, anti-director rights, one share, one vote, creditor rights, and accounting standards. So, so the top line, right, top row is China, and the rest is India, Pakistan, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. Okay, so for efficiency of judicial system, there's no, there's NA for China. Rule of law, as you can see, is 5, right? So it's in the middle to high range. Okay, and then the corruption, right, is in fact, yes, is the lowest. Okay, and then anti-director rights is 3, right? So again, somewhere in the middle, and then one share, one vote, yes. So, and creditor rights 2. So these are the summary statistics, summary scores, and then accounting standards. There's no, it's NA, but you can see that we're compared with other emerging countries. But some of the, like corruption and creditor rights may be lower, but it's not necessarily, very low, right? It's still perhaps middle to, upper range. So this is how China stands against, emerging economies. So next thing is how does this financial market develop, or what's the state of the financial markets? But in this case, financial markets, they compare the banking sector, right? Because in China, a large part of financing, external financing, comes from banks, right? Especially these are state-owned banks, right? So state-owned banks. And then there's this stock market. Yeah, now it's very large, but in the mid-90s, it was still emerging, right? So this is basically comparing this market. Market means stock market and the bank, okay? So when they did this study, I don't think there was much of this bond market. I talked about bond market earlier. So bond market has actually become larger and larger these years. So if you did the study now, then you probably would have to include the bond market. Yeah. But in case of the bond market, I showed you that it's mostly coming from local governments, right? So it's not necessarily the firm sector, but the bond market does finance firms indirectly, okay? So, but anyway, so when they did this survey, it was basically stock market versus the banks, okay? Okay, so how did they, what variables they look at? Well, first, they look at, they call structural activity, which means that they compare the size of the the activity in the stock market, which is traded value, which is the value traded, and then against the bank credit, okay? So that's how they look at. So it's basically they look at the log of value traded over bank credit, okay? And next thing is the size, right? Size is comparing the market capitalization of the stock market and the bank credit, okay? And then efficiency, comparing the efficiency of the stock market versus the bank. What they look at is the market capitalization ratio, which means, it's right here, market capitalization ratio is basically the ratio of domestic equities listed on domestic exchange over GDP, okay? So it's comparing against the GDP. And then the efficiency measure for the bank is they look at the overhead cost ratio. Overhead cost ratio of the bank is right here. It's basically the average of banks' non-interest expenses, okay, divided by total assets. So that's what they look at. So it's an expense, right? If the non-interest expense is greater, maybe like wages or other activities of the bank, usually the bank's largest expense should be paying interest, right, to the depositors, right? So that's basically the largest expense. But if the bank has other expenses other than interest payment, then they think that can be a measure of inefficiency of the bank management. Yeah, so that's what they look at, overhead cost of banks. Okay? So what they do is they compare this market capitalization ratio, which is, if it's higher, then it's more efficient, right? If the overhead cost is higher, then it's inefficient, right? So that's why this is multiple, okay? It's not division here. It's log of market capitalization ratio times, right, our overhead cost ratio. Because overhead cost ratio is an inefficiency measure, right? Market capitalization ratio is an efficiency capitalization measure. So that's why, in a sense, you can say that you can look at this as inverse of overhead cost ratio, which is 1 over overhead cost ratio would be the efficiency measure, right? So then if you think that way, it's basically dividing market capitalization ratio, right? You divide market capitalization ratio with 1 over overhead cost ratio. So in that case, it's an inverse. So that's why this measure becomes multiple here. Okay? It's a bit, confusing, but but that's how they compare, for activity, size, and efficiency. Okay? And then on the right-hand side, what they look at is basically a combined measure, which is market and the bank. So that's why in this case, it's, they look at the size, which is market capitalization ratio, times private credit ratio. Okay? Private credit ratio is a credit by deposit money banks and other financial institutions to the private sector, okay, divided by the GDP. So that's what they call the private credit ratio. Okay, and then finance activity is again, it's a activity, so that's why it's traded, right? It's traded value times the private credit ratio. Yeah, and then the efficiency is the same. It's basically, is this log of total value traded ratio divided by overhead cost. Okay. So, so these are the, the total, right? It's the market and the stock market and the banking sector together, they look at the size, activity, and efficiency. Okay. So using these measures, then they compare, again, the LLSV sample, right? English origin, French, German, Scandinavian, and then the sample average here, and then China in the last column. Okay. So what strikes here is this. Okay. So especially if you look at the bank and market size, so this is like a size, right? If you look at the bank credit over GDP, China is very large, right? It shows that the amount of external financing that goes through the banking market, banking sector, is quite large compared to the GDP. Okay. Of course, now this ratio probably is less than at this time, but still, I think the banking sector is quite large. Right? Sample average for LLSV is 0.73, but as you can see, right, China is 1.11. And typically the German origin countries like Japan and Germany are bank-dominated financing. The bank financing is quite dominant, so that's why its average is 0.99, right? But you can see that still China is larger. But of course, if you compare Germany and maybe Japan separately, it could be as large as China, or maybe it could be higher. Yeah. Okay, but you can see that the bank credit over GDP is quite large. So which means that a lot of financing is still going through the banking system. Okay. Well, you can understand, right? Because stock market has been relatively new, right? It's basically started in the 1990s. Okay. Okay. Bank efficiency, overhead cost of bank total asset, and you can see that it's a bit small, but here sample average is 0.03, right? China is 0.12. So this shows that the overhead cost of the banking sector is greater in China. So this points to a somewhat inefficient banking system. But that is what people have been still talking, because China's banking sector is mainly state-owned, right? So that's why inefficiency has been already pointed out by many people. Okay, and then looking at the value of stock market, total value over GDP, at this point, yes, it's still smaller than the LLSV average, but I'm pretty sure this ratio of 0.11 in China is much larger now. Okay, and then market capitalization over GDP, right? It's 0.47 for some LLSV average, but China is 0.32. But again, I think this should be much larger now. Okay. Okay. So now, next thing is in the middle part of this table is comparing market, right? Stock market and banking, right? So if you look at the activity, you can see, well, this is the log. These numbers are in log. So if it's more negative, because it's market versus bank, right? So if this is more, well, if it's more bigger, which means then here, right? If it's much bigger means less negative, then the market activity is larger than the bank activity. So, well, let's look at English origin, right? So this is the lowest, right? Is the negative is least negative, which means that the market, stock market, is greater, is more active than the banking sector. Right? So if you look at French origin, it's the lowest, which means it's comparing market versus bank. So it's more negative, means that relatively to the stock market, the banking sector is more active. So if you look at China, right, it's 1.07, right? So, but actually, it is less negative, right, than the average, which means that actually the stock market, right, in terms of the activity, is more, greater, relatively greater than the banking market. Okay, size. If you compare the size, this is more negative in China, which means that banking sector, right, is larger than the market, right? But you can see the activity is relatively, stock market is more active, okay? And then efficiency is here, right? So it's again, if you compare with the average, then the 1.48 means it's less negative, right? Which means that stock market compared to the banking market is more efficient. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. Aggregate. Okay. Let me see. What was that? Structure. Aggregate. Efficiency. Okay. See. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I was trying to look at what was structure aggregate, because we don't have that here. Let me see. Yeah, I think it's all right. Yeah, it's okay. It's in the paper somewhere. Okay, so now looking at the development, right? This is basically banking and the market sector together. And then here, the average, LLSB average is 1.58 versus China is 0.85. So actually, activity is, is quite active, right? But the size, right, is yet smaller than the LLSB average. Efficiency is again lower, right? So this basically shows you that first this, the banking sector is large, right? There's a lot, but the banking sector is inefficient, right? So especially if you compare with the market, stock market, then the stock market look much efficient, right? And also there's much more activity in terms of trading. So that's why this picture or this table shows that, yes, right, the size of China's banking sector is large, right? So that we saw compared to the GDP. And we know that most of the banking credit goes to the state-owned enterprise, okay? Or the listed sector, and doesn't go much to the private sector. Okay? And then the size, right? This suggests that the China's banking sector is much larger than its financial markets, which is the stock market. Yeah. So, so this is much more than the LLSB sample countries. Okay. Activity. On the other hand, the stock market is active, relatively much more active than the banking, okay? And then efficiency is, as I said, the efficiency of the stock market is much better than the banking sector. So this is because comparing market and the banks. Okay? But we can see, right, from the overhead costs, the Chinese banking system seems, at least during this sample period, was not that efficient. Yeah, so basically that's what, this is basically the summary of this table. Okay. And if you compare this, external market, this is external financing on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis is the investor protection, and this is comparing different countries, LSV sample, and then I put China right here. So investor protection here is below average as of when they did this survey, and so China, at least in the early 2000s or in the mid 90s, stands around here. Okay? But you can see this positive correlation, right? Which means that this is basically what LLSV says, right? If you have better investor protection, then you can raise more money, right? So which means the external market is much larger. Yeah, so this is external market is basically an overall external market score, which is like, external capitalization over GNP, domestic firms, over population, and all these measures that we saw before. So this is like it's a score, overall score. So you can see there's a upward trend, or not trend, but it's a positive correlation, and you can see Hong Kong and Singapore is way up there. Okay. Yeah. So this is where the next thing is So first, China's protection, of course, it's not at the highest end, but compared to other countries, it's not as bad. Okay. Of course, there is a problem with the corruption score is quite low. Okay. But in that case, right? As I said earlier, the state or the listed sector most likely is more regulated or governed by law. So that's why they should grow faster, right? So that's basically the proposition from law and economics. But if you look at this table, this is the growth rate from 1996 to 2002, industrial production, panel A. Panel B is investment in fixed assets. And this is comparing state and listed sector on the right-hand side and the right column, and left column, and private sector on the right column, right? So if you look at this, of course, the state sector and listed sector are, in a sense, is growing fast, like 14% in 2000, 6% in 2002. And 95 to 02, average is 5.4. So if you compare this growth rate to other countries, this is very fast, right? Still very fast. But if you look at the private sector, the growth is much faster, right? It's 14%, more than 14% on average. And investment in fixed assets, again, right? State and listed sector on average is 8.2% growth. But private sector actually is growing faster at 11.5%. So this is investment in fixed assets. So there has been a lot of capital accumulation in the non-listed sector over these years. Yeah, so that's basically what the data says. So that's why these authors say this is a puzzle, right? These state and listed sectors should be well governed by law. But if you look at the growth, the private sector is growing much faster. Yeah. And also employment is true. Actually, employment is much greater in the private sector or the non-listed sector. If you look at the percentage, right? Like 76% in 2002, right, is employed by the private sector. State and listed sectors is like 24%. Yeah, so that is what we see from the data. And so therefore, this article, poses a question, right? Because good law and institutions promote economic growth. So that's basically the story of law and finance, right? So, but the fact is that non-listed private sector grew faster than the listed sector. And actually, non-listed private sector relied less on bank credit, right? Because most of the state-owned banks would lend to a state-owned company or state-controlled company, but not necessarily the private companies. And and then the banking sector is large, right, but not efficient. See, so there could be inefficient lending to SOEs, which means that when the firms are in trouble, right? If some SOEs are in trouble, then the government bank may step in to help the company. Okay, so so that could have happened. We'll talk about these kind of things in the last week when we talk about the banking crisis or the financial crisis in Japan, right? So that's when, after the crash of the financial bubble, a lot of companies were in trouble, right? But then, what did the banks do? Well, some of the banks, or quite a few, many of the banks, try to help these troubled companies. Okay, so but if banks always try to do this, then the bank's performance also become very poor, right? Because these companies that are in trouble often cannot pay the interest, right, to the banks, or maybe cannot pay back the loan, right? But still the banks are not cutting the credit, right? So that's why the bank's performance gets worse. So that's probably one of the reasons that state-owned banks are not doing well. But of course, their objective might be to save the firms, right? Not to make the profit. So that might be the reason. Okay, and then the other thing about why China's non-listed sector grew fast is this, right? This is especially from in the early 90s to maybe the mid 90s. This township village enterprise was growing very fast. Okay, so this is one of the areas that was liberalized, or when the market mechanism was introduced. And I think the first the sector that benefited was these township village enterprises. Okay. So these were so-called TVEs could have driven the growth of the of the private sector. And the last part is, this, right? So these are, suggested, reasons why private sectors grew fast. But one of the things that is not in the paper, they mention this, but they don't have an analysis. But it's basically the financing of this private sector was coming from so-called informal financing. Okay, so this is especially true, especially in the early 90s or the mid 90s, that a lot of financing came from like families, right, or foreign companies, but it's not those big companies, right? And then they financed these relatively small companies in China, especially around this Zhuhai, right, area, which is outside Hong Kong, Guangzhou, in that area. So, so I think this informal financing must have played a large role. Yeah. So I do have a colleague actually, who actually, well, he was from Taiwan, but he has a family or relative in China. So what he does is in this company that he managed to help, also financing, was one of the largest. He said at that point it was already had the largest share, one of the largest share, not the largest, in LED, the light LED lamps, right? So this was already in the maybe late 90s. Yeah. So this company is not a listed company, right? Had one of the largest share of the LED lights. Yeah. But he said it was at that time, was a very simple one. Right? Nowadays, you can have different colors and all these things, but at that time, I think it was only one color, simple technology, but I had a very large share. So he basically, helped the financing. I think he put his own money there, and also the management. So I think these kind of things happen quite a bit. Okay, so basically, yeah, so in case of China's growth, if you put this in the context of law and finance, there is a puzzle, okay? Okay, let me see. Yeah, so this is the puzzle, right? So according to the literature of law and economic growth, better law and enforcement is associated with greater economic growth. Right, but what is the puzzle, right? Well, because the private sector grew faster, okay? And what are the possible explanations? Well, here are some of them, yeah. But this paper, Alan Chen and Chen, doesn't really go deep into why, okay? They show the puzzle, right? But then they don't really go into the analysis because they didn't have the data at that time. But now this Professor Chen has one paper. It's already, I think it's forthcoming, and they look at informal financing. Yeah. So, but then they compare also informal financing against other emerging countries. But I think they show that informal financing is not that China has very large proportion of informal financing. She says it's about it's comparable to other countries. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So so this was the this state-owned sector, but here, I would like to show you, more recent trend, right? So, but even this recent trend is changing, okay? So this is an article from 2015, okay? And this is, citing, this article was citing this book by Nicholas Lardy. So he's like a researcher, economist in the US, and he wrote a book called Markets Over Mao. Okay? And when he wrote this, it's published in 2000, maybe 15, right? So perhaps it's the facts are, from maybe early 2000, okay? And he says, well, the government's effort to groom national champions, much feared by Western multinationals, have resulted in a huge misallocation of national resources. So this comment, right, on average, the returns of state firms make on the assets are less than half the cost of their capital. So this is somewhat consistent with what we found, right? Because the state-owned firms or state-controlled firms have lower performance. Okay. So but here he says, contrary to the widespread belief that China is heading full steam towards state capitalism, the surprising story of the past decade has been the steady retreat of state enterprises from the whole sectors of the economy. So basically, he's saying that, yes, the private sector has grown. But that's something that we know, right? Because there are so many private companies listed, right, in Chinese stock market and has grown very fast, right? So that's basically in the 2000, right? Okay. And this is in 2015. The state companies, right, account for just over half of Shanghai's market value. Okay, so this is basically showing that, well, the private sector, now the listed, right? These are listed private companies. In Allen, Chen, and Chen's China's growth puzzle paper, when they say private companies, these are not listed, right? So basically the listed companies are mostly state-controlled, right, former SOEs. So that's what they were looking at until early 2000. Okay? But now the private listed, right, companies has grown so much. Okay? So that's what they're talking about. And there are a lot of incentives for the managers, right? So to align the incentives of the managers with the shareholders, they have introduced, like stock options, right? So this is what we learned in the textbooks, right? Financial textbook, to mitigate the agency problem. So now, innovation like stock options for senior executives, and so these are the things that have been introduced. So, so that's what has been happening. Yeah. So, like, it's not just for CEOs, but as I said, right, it's written here, like key persons, like senior executives, are given these incentives. It's not all the companies, of course, but this is spreading. So, so these are, what's happening in the private business, but as well as, the state-owned companies are also introducing these things. Okay, so this is 2015, right? Okay, and then this is 2018. Okay, so this is like just less than half a year ago, or just only like 4 months ago. Yeah, so so things are, again, seems to be changing again. Okay, so well, non-state sector contributes close to 2/3 of China's GDP growth, right? So it's an 8/10 of all new jobs. So still, you can see that the private sector, right, non-state sector is growing. Okay, so that's still the trend. So the proportion of private ownership, right, is rising, and still the SOE's return on asset is half of that. So that part is the same. Okay, but this is something that has been changing. Okay, recent changes. Okay, January, October 2018. This is last year. Profits of SOEs grew by 17% compared with the same 10 months last year. Those at private companies fell by 19%. Okay? Although, the proportion of private companies has been increasing, and also the ROA, right, the return on asset is much higher for the private companies. But if you look at the growth, right, the profit growth increased for SOEs last year, but private companies fell. Okay, and also there has been a lot of bankruptcies between 2016 and 2018, and these were mostly privately owned. Okay. And this is it's an investment bank, CICC. Over half of all deals in which a controlling stake was sold this year were nationalizations. Okay, what does that mean? It means that the government bought the stake. Okay. Before, government was selling, right, their stake to the private sector. But now, it's sort of, last year was a reverse trend. Okay. So 29 listed firms on the Shanghai and Shenzhen Stock Exchange have sold a controlling interest to the state. Okay. So it's like a reverse trend. And what the state is looking at is, right, they want a tidy return. Okay, so because private companies have, higher performance, right? So therefore, if the state sector buys into this private sector, or if the SOEs, right, buy a stake in the private companies, their profit, right, or the performance will go up. Okay, so that's why SOEs want to invest in private firms. Okay, instead of before SOE was selling their equity, right, the shares to the public, so that's privatization. But now, like the recent trend is that the government sector or the state sector is investing, right? You can say investing in the private sector. So it looks like that has been the trend since last year. And so if you look at this trend, this is what we're going to talk about, perhaps not today, but next week, is that, well, I'll talk a little bit, like when we look at the government ownership, right, controlling ownership in one of the earlier tables that we saw, say for Singapore, right? had a large state ownership. Remember that, right? But then I said, oh, that is coming from the sovereign wealth funds, because there are sovereign wealth funds, which is government-run funds, called like a Temasek, right, or GIC, Government Investment Corporations. So what they do is they basically invest in private companies, right? But the thing is, they do have, it's not just a passive investment, they do have some influence on the management, okay? So, but the fact is that they have a big portfolio of firms, right? And then they invest, right? So in some sense, what has happening in China, well, has happening last year or even now, seems like it's becoming closer to that model, right? So basically, the state sector is becoming like an investor in the private sector. Of course, I believe if they are the major shareholder, they could influence the management. But but looks like that is the way China is developing, right? So before it was state-owned enterprise, right, being privatized, right? So that was a big trend, right? But now the private companies have, private sector has increased their share. So the government is now becoming an investor into the private sector. So it looks like that is the trend, that we are seeing, right? We don't have a comprehensive study on this yet, but this is because I'm relying on this newspaper, right? But things, so-called the state capitalism, right? What we call state capitalism. The shape of the state capitalism in China could be changing. Yeah, it might be. It looks like it's becoming more like Singapore. Yeah. Okay, so okay, let me see. Any questions? I'll stop here because if I go, then I have to stop in the middle. So. Any question about the quiz? Not the quiz, sorry. The project. No? Okay. All right, then, yeah, this Thursday is a holiday, right? Yeah, so I'll see you next week then. I don't think I need to do a makeup because I think I can finish everything. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. There was more. Yeah, so you mean there's no corruption? Less corruption? Yeah. So it's better than I thought that was
look at English origin. That's right. Yeah. So it cannot be better. Yeah. So that, yeah, the higher the score, it's better.